Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, identity politics appear to have an increasing grip on British politics and indeed our culture. But who is behind identity politics and how do they maintain its extraordinary and growing influence? Ben Cobley is the author of this book, which is called The Tribe, the Liberal Left and the System of Diversity. He is a journalist. He's also a former Labour activist, and he is the author of a blog called A Free Left Blog, and he's with me now. Ben, thank you very, very much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
The book is called The Tribe, so let's start at the beginning. What is the tribe?
Well, the tribe is in the subtitle, The Liberal Left,
Yeah.
as I call it, or you could say in its full title, getting very wordy, The Progressive Liberal Left. Now, I think of this as an identifiable group, but on the other hand, I think the way that we can identify it means that we can all sort of fall in and out of it as almost as we like by kind of picking up its idioms, which for me are based around identity politics and about favouring certain groups and protecting certain groups, and more generally, indirectly, sort of unfavouring the other groups, because it's a sort of zero-sum game.
Yeah. You said the subtitle is the system of diversity. So what is this system? I mean, that tends to imply a kind of practical, a very practical system.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting question. I think I call it like a system of relations.
Yeah.
So you can say, like in a call and response sort of situation, say the liberal left, someone who's of a liberal left disposition will make a call, and then you can get a predictable response. Say if you're on Twitter, and recently we've had John Cleese getting into trouble with him talking about London not feeling very English anymore. If you say that's racist, immediately you'll get a positive response from the rest of the gang. Right. So in terms of that's how I see it in terms of being systemic, in a way that it's predictable, but also that there are relations not just between, say, people on the liberal left side of politics, but then to like the representatives of the favoured identity groups. And there's also, I would say, like a call and response that goes on between those two groups, and it makes it kind of systemic in character. And sorry if I'm waffling with this.
No, not
but it kind of makes it systemic in character because those representatives tend to act in a certain way.
Right.
In order for those relations to work in a predictable fashion, they have to represent their groups as being victims, almost universal victims of society and of the unfavoured groups of the system. And if they do that, then just everything sort of fits in. They can claim maximum victimhood, and the liberal left, who is overseeing and supporting them, has a justification for doing that.
So I think we sort of know, but for clarity's sake, who would the favoured groups be then?
So we're looking at firstly women, non-white people, gay people. I think immigrants is an interesting category. It's more, I would say, sort of people who appear to be immigrants.
Yes.
So in contrast to sort of, you might say, native English or British people.
Right.
Also Muslims is an important category, I guess, within the non-white grouping.
Right. And the unfavoured groups would be what, straight white males?
Well, it's us lot.
Yeah.
It's mostly straight white males.
Well, no, I've got favoured characteristics being gay, but apparently.
Right, yes.
I've got protected characteristics, apparently.
So if you don't, looking at the system, if someone like you doesn't play up to that gay identity as being a victim of society, then you don't fit into the system.
Right. Yes,
and in a way you're a traitor.
Yes, exactly.
To the system.
I think it's particularly right because particular vitriol is actually reserved, if you're not going to type, as it were. But so you have the groups, but so what happens then, for example, if the demands of one group or the rights of whatever one group are essentially met? What happens there if it appears that equality is enshrined or whatever, what happens? Do they stop being a favoured group? It doesn't appear to be that way.
Oh, not at all. No, I mean, that's the thing, it's a system of politics, and whatever happens in society, the system must keep going for people to continue in their roles. If you're a liberal left person who, takes a stance overseeing society, if there's a situation where, as we have in our country, I think, in a lot of ways where, women are doing very well, especially young women, non-white people are doing well, especially certain groups like Indians and Chinese, doing very well in society. But that doesn't fit the narrative.
No.
So if you're part of this system of diversity, as I call it, you can't play up to that, or maybe if you do, you can do it in terms of favouring those groups and saying, aren't those groups doing well and to be praised? It can never be praising the, say British society or English society, or Western society, you could say.
Oh, yes, exactly. Well, this is an entirely Western thing, isn't it?
Pretty much. Although, with a globalised culture, it has sort of got tentacles into everywhere. I mean, I guess I immediately thought of South Africa, but you could say that's in a way part of the Western world. But I guess, the whole world to an extent is westernised now. But places like, Japan and China, they kind of find this sort of stuff incomprehensible, really.
The thing is that, I mentioned at the top there that it's increasing influence. This seems to be going, exponentially throughout all institutions. I mean, right, now into charities, into what have you. I wonder, how does that actually happen? I mean, one's not a conspiracy theorist or whatever, but how is this actually? How we arrived at the situation where apparently now even corporations, HR departments, all the rest of it, now basically practice this particular approach, don't they?
I think it's largely that, and obviously there's so many different angles, things going into it, but it's that point about it's almost a tautology that. This stuff has become completely dominant in society, and there's very little counter narratives which are prevailing. In that sense, say if you're looking at businesses, they tend to follow what's popular.
Right. So it's purely window dressing in their case.
To an extent, I think that the huge influence of these forms of politics is such that they are serious about it, and they're doing more than you might expect if they were just window dressing. But in terms of charities, I think if you look at charities or civil society in general, it's overwhelmingly progressive and liberal left in character. I think if you look at perhaps other versions of the left or conservatives, they've largely sort of abandoned civil society for me. And it's allowed the progressive liberal left to basically prevail. And I think during the Labour government years, New Labour, this sort of expanded a hell of a lot, and through outsourcing especially. So,
what do you mean by that? Explain.
So a lot of charities now, but also businesses, government outsourcing services into the charity sector and into the business sector, and that means that there's more basically political patronage on offer. Right. While if you're working just through government, then you've got to rely on the civil service. Although of course the civil service has largely been taken over by this stuff as well. But through outsourcing to charities and handing out public money to charities, that meant that political activists could get more involved and get hold of public money and use it. And I think if you look at the charity sector now, at least that's kind of around politics, you can see that so many of the people involved are, like, especially former Labour activists, or at least are visibly politically connected from their past. And I wouldn't say, I mean, like you, to talk about it as some sort of conspiracy. I don't see it like that. I kind of see it as almost happening by accident, and in politics, the Labour Party being in government, being very active in government and doing a lot of things.
I mean, you used to be a Labour Party
Yes.
activist. Used to be, that's right, isn't it? You're
Yes,
not.
that's right, yeah.
But you know, I think you mentioned in the book the Labour Party has become entirely controlled, if you like, now by identity politics. Really, I mean, to the point where it wasn't, presumably they just got impatient of waiting for working class people to maybe rebel or whatever it is, or what?
I think largely through time, if you look at the traditional Marxist view of history, where the proletariat, the working class, is the agent of history, which is going to overthrow capitalism and bring about utopia on earth. Obviously that didn't happen, and there were no signs of it happening. And even just on a more sort of prosaic level, the working class were never aligned to the conventional forms of politics that progressive intellectuals tended to have. So identity politics, as we see it now, has kind of offered alternative groups to kind of put into that role. In quite an informal way, but you often see in the way that these people talk, the politicians and activists, that they do have sort of transcendental sort of utopian hopes for example, Britain becoming more and more diverse and multicultural, and for women, rising up in power. That this is a good by definition, and like I say, there's some real sort of truly utopian sort of hopes behind it.
Is it sort of, maybe a naive question, but is it a sincere desire on their part, or is it entirely to break down what they see as power structures? Because on the face of it, you could say, well, what's wrong in having more women in power and all the rest of it?
Exactly. There's some good aspects to it, of course, and there's some goodwill. And I tend to see that it's a mixture of so much stuff going on. There's naivety in one sense. There are some genuine sort of philosophical, ideological, sort of quite harsh beliefs about transforming the country and getting rid of Englishness or even Britishness, but especially Englishness, and destroying like white male culture. But I think generally it's on the everyday level, most politicians and activists really don't feel like that. It's more a matter of just fitting in and not causing trouble, and aligning to the affiliations with the right groups.
Because I just seem to remember, I'd say around about the 1980s with Ken Livingstone, that this kind of the rainbow coalition of minorities, that's when I first became aware of it really taking shape. And it was sort of up to that point, the left was very much about, trying to further the condition, looking after, if you're working class people or whatever. It was around about then. Would you agree with that? That it sort of pretty much changed?
Well, funny enough, this isn't something I've really looked into in my book.
Right.
I mean, really, in my book, I've deliberately didn't look to write history.
Right.
I looked to write about how it works now on an everyday level. Sort of, like I said before, like how the call and response sort of works. What the cues are and what the consequences of this are. So really, with that type of thing, I'm really not. You're probably more of an expert than I am.
Have you got any examples of you can give us from the book of the way that the system stays in place, or an instance that comes to mind, maybe?
Oh, sorry, of the system.
Yes, in the way
maintaining itself.
Yes, exactly. Or, for example, how? Because I think, look, the main point is really that when you talk about the liberal left, basically people, and I think they're right, think that this is a relatively small number of people, right? How come that a relatively small number of people can have such a massive effect actually on the culture of a country?
I wouldn't say it's a small number of people at all.
Really?
And if we're looking at charities, if we're looking at public service, civil service, teaching profession, obviously into universities, we're talking about very large numbers of people, and especially through the education system, through indoctrination, for younger people coming out of university, largely being aligned to those sorts of ways of thinking. So I don't think it's a small number of people at all. It's huge. And if you look on social media, Twitter. It's very clear to see that it's huge.
There's a piece in The Spectator by Toby Young this week, and he's talking about, this is really going strong in America, isn't it, what we're talking about, the whole diversity.
Yes.
He's talking about it coming gradually here, and he mentions, for example, a statistic, the 4,700 employees for the Department of Education here now all have to have unconscious bias training. Would this be this is a part of the system in a way, isn't it?
Yes, and unconscious bias training is quite common now, and is spreading not just through our public services, but through the charity sector, and then in the charity sector into charities going in and indoctrinating. Well, maybe that's a bit of a strong word, but perhaps attempting to indoctrinate businesses and business employees. So. I think that's quite a good point. A lot of it does arise in America, whereas with so many things, it's a lot stronger, a lot sort of more assertive and aggressive in America. Although we can see over here, we are following pretty heavily and pretty successfully in that sense.
Did you find it hard to get your book published? I mean, it's a very, the publishing industry, I would say on the whole, is pretty left. Very left, in fact, and I think that what's happened over the past, certainly since the referendum, is that they've kind of doubled down. They haven't opened. They've really sort of like battened down the hatches on that. You didn't have any trouble getting published?
Well, I did, and for a while I tried to get an agent and completely failed at getting an agent. I didn't go direct to many publishers. I was quite lucky in that an opportunity came up with a very small publisher, but I knew. I mean, I'd been writing on this stuff for years.
Yeah.
I'd written 100+ articles, mostly on identity politics, and it got reasonably well known.
Yeah.
And I got no interest at all from, especially from liberal left publishers. Relentless sort of ignoring and rejection.
Yeah.
And you just got to accept that. But I do think of myself as quite lucky to have got through that and to have got it published, even, like I say, with a very small publisher.
You had some help from Claire Fox,
That's
didn't you?
right, yeah.
What happened there? She just championed the project?
Well, she read, I think, an article or two I'd written about Brexit and the arts.
And the arts?
And the arts, yes.
Oh, right.
And she responded well to those, and we met, and she said, she would try and help me with the book, get it published. And a few weeks later, she wrote to a publisher, and then I was lucky enough to get a contract. So I owe a lot to her, and she's one of my heroes anyway, but even more so with that.
Interestingly, you were writing there about Brexit and the arts. I don't know what the particular thrust of your article was, but what certainly became clear is that the arts were like 90% pro-Remain and what have you. I worked in the arts for a long time as a journalist and TV program maker. And again, you had an extraordinary kind of uniformity of views, and I think that the identity politics and the system of diversity that you talk about in your book is very strong, is it, in the creative field? Very much so. It's almost like they're the kind of visual display unit for it in a way.
Yes, it's in a sense, the arts have become subject to politics.
Yeah.
And that's there's always been a close relationship, and I wouldn't say that artists shouldn't be political. I mean, the reverse. But when there's such a uniformity, a sameness, and where actual messaging itself has become artistic, in a sense, or gets sold as art, just sort of ranting about Nigel Farage or Boris Johnson, you'll find sort of exhibits doing that in art galleries and things. So I think there's an extraordinary extent to which that has spread, because like I say, it's always been around, and sort of with modernistic art as well. It's always been quite political, but it's gone a lot further, certainly.
Do you think there's anything as well in the view that, for example, the gay lobby achieved many of the things they wanted, civil partnerships, marriage, what have you. fine. But then sort of suddenly, almost out of the blue, comes transgenderism. It's almost like we have to quickly replace, one group with another.
I wouldn't see it like that. Again, I'd see it, looking at the transgender lobby itself, seeing how other groups have been very successful using a certain model of maximising their victimhood, relentless hammering away political activism, contributing very actively to political consultations, for example, on the gender issue in government, to the extent that you've had a Conservative government almost sort of repeating their mantras. I think it's more them, like I say, copying that sort of way, that sort of approach. And again, like I say, with the system of relations, the liberal left, or the liberal left way of relating to the world and relating to identity, going, here's another example of what we support and what we protect.
And you remain victims regardless of your economic circumstance or whatever. That's the point with identity politics, isn't it?
I think, it's all very superficial, this stuff. It's surface level. Once you get into the reality of it, it does fall apart, a lot of the the truth of it, the reality of it. So if that's your backup, you can't be going into the detail of it. You've just got to sort of discuss it on a superficial sort of surface level. And if enough people do that around you and relate in the right ways, like I say, then it doesn't really matter if it's nonsense.
Yeah. You mentioned at the beginning there John Cleese, who's quite a recent example. But what happens if you fall foul of this? I mean, that was a Twitter storm. Okay, you can sort of almost discount, well, not discount, but it's Twitter, right? That happens on Twitter. But what happens if you, in a work situation or in an institution, if you had qualms about this sort of thing, what would happen? Presumably, you'd be put beyond the pale, wouldn't you?
Well, there's cases happening all the time, of people complaining about discrimination and taking to tribunals and making complaints, and people losing their jobs over it. And obviously, some of those are going to be real instances of racism, etc., of nastiness. But a lot of it isn't. A lot of it is just sort of casual remarks that don't completely align to the consensus, or to the apparent consensus, which is about the favoured groups must appear as victims and in need of protection. Yeah. So whenever someone from a favoured group, I give the obvious example in the introduction to my book of the Rotherham child abuse, mass child abuse cases, and in that, you had a lot of people in Rotherham who knew what was going on, and in public services who knew what was going on, but they were so afraid of the denunciations that were coming for being racist that they wouldn't do anything.
Yes.
So you see one form of protection triumphing over another. So the form of protection of the men who were committing these crimes prevailing over the protection of children, and you could say largely another favoured group, girls, but they didn't have, in that circumstance, anyone really on their side.
Exactly. So and then when, actually that's a good example, because when people might have pointed out things after, like the MP didn't she, or wrote an article. Her name was Sarah. What is her name now? The MP.
Well, Sarah Champion.
Sarah Champion. Yes. She wrote a piece, and you've not really heard from her since, have you? It's extraordinary.
It's remarkable how it happens. Of suddenly people who don't align. I said earlier to the consensus, but it's more just aligned to the the favoured, unfavoured distinctions. And if you come out and don't conform to that, then you're going to get put outside the system, or you have already put yourself outside the system of diversity, I would say. So like you say with Sarah Champion, now she just doesn't really appear in public life. She was a junior minister for the government at the time. Sorry, for the Labour Party.
That's right.
Junior shadow minister, and she lost her position very quickly, and we've barely heard of her since. And this is this is the way it works, but it's also the way it kind of has to work, you know, because otherwise this system of relations, like I talk about, it kind of falls apart.
What is the prognosis? What, if you look to the future, how can this system, if you like, and be challenged, or can't it, do you think?
It's a very good question, and a very difficult question to engage with an answer, and I try to in my book, because, you know, we are talking about a dominant system of politics, which is excluding other ways, just basic other ways of doing politics, in all corners of public life, and even to a large extent in private life. So combating it, I mean, a lot of us do already, for example, by writing articles, but you're always responding to what's being put out there, and there's so much being put out there at all times that you just can't keep up.
No, yeah.
I mean, I think sometimes you could easily write a daily newspaper of what's going on in relation to progressive identity politics and also the backlash. But the crucial thing is organisation, because if you like, they are organised. And that's a large measure of their success, that they have institutions which are well funded and continually are producing reports, who have people who are, you know, are spokespeople in public life, who are available to turn up. So we find with that, like we said before, I think the progressive liberal left is kind of just appears to be dominant. It's always there. It's always appearing in public life. And alternative views are always kind of appearing almost as a response, and never sort of so much putting their own sort of standpoint out. So, I mean, one thing I'm really interested in is the way that identity politics reduces standards in all areas. I mean, we talked about art, you know, the politicisation of art. We could say democracy as well, with Brexit as well. I think identity politics is wrapped up in the whole Brexit affair, and it's a reason why so many left people turned against Brexit, because there was a politicisation along those system of diversity lines from the beginning. The Roman campaign was doing that. So we've got art, democracy. I think just on a wider notion, truth.
Yes.
Just the idea of truth. And we talked about Rotherham, but with so many of these affairs, these media storms which come out, and for example with John Cleese, the people commenting on it were not commenting on what he said at all. They were commenting on associations that they had made with him mentioning Englishness, and, you know, not feeling that London is English anymore, and interpreting that straight away of him being a racist, you know. And like I said before, if enough people support that and go along with that, it doesn't really matter if it's a lie. Or maybe lie is too strong a word. I would say it's more bullshit, because they're not really concerned with the truth. They're not really engaging with what is said and what is done. So in terms of combating it, I think you're looking at, maybe that's a bit abstract and vague, but you are looking at institutions which are looking to tell the truth and which are looking to promote, promote the pursuit of truth and of protection of democracy and the promotion of beauty, you know, through art, for example.
And indeed books like yours, which are very, very important, Ben. Thank you very, very much for coming on. It is called, by the way, again, The Tribe, the Liberal Left and the System of Diversity. You can get it on Amazon, is that right?
Yes, it's on Amazon, also on the publisher's website if you search for it.
It's a very, very important book. Thank you very much, Ben.
Thanks very
much. And look forward to seeing you next time on So What You're Saying Is. Thank you. Oh, and by the way, please do subscribe.